Dear Secretary General, thank you very much for your very comprehensive and insightful presentation. Now we have, I don't know, 20, 25 minutes, maybe slightly more for Q&A questions, Q&A sessions. And let me ask you the first question. The Northern Alliance is by far the most powerful military alliance in the world. There is no doubt about this, and the probability of a direct military attack on alliance is, again, pretty low. But the alliance is facing challenges from outside, and these challenges are not direct, are not always military. We have, and these challenges are commonly called like hybrid challenges or hybrid attacks. It's a combination of propaganda, cyber, etc. So how the alliance is facing these challenges, and what are the alliance, what are the means mobilized by the alliance to face these challenges?
You are absolutely right that the probability for any conventional military attack against any NATO ally is very low. And that's because NATO has been able to respond, to adapt to a more demanding security environment with a more assertive Russia in the east, but also with the turmoil to the south. We have implemented the biggest reinforcement to our collective defense since the end of the Cold War, and we provide credible deterrence, sending a clear message to any potential aggressor that we are able, we have the capabilities, we have the resolve to respond if attacked. And that's the credible deterrence which prevents conflicts and attacks on NATO allies. It has proven successful for decades. So the challenge is that we have aggressors, we have adversaries, which are trying to attack us below the Article 5 threshold without triggering our collective defense clause. And they do so in different ways with hybrid and cyber tactics. We see cyber attacks daily from state and non-state actors in varying degree of seriousness, but at least it's something which is ongoing. You know, when we speak about conventional attacks, then we speak about something that may happen in the future. Cyber attacks is happening every day. Hybrid is also happening almost every day, meaning that we have disinformation, propaganda, we have this combination of covert and overt operations, we see what is going on in eastern Ukraine, and so on. So our challenge is that we need to be able also to respond to this kind of threats. We do that by significantly increasing our cyber capabilities. We have increased our own capabilities to defend NATO networks. There is no military conflict without a big cyber component. We have to be able to keep our cyber networks, which are so crucial for command and control, safe. But we also have to help allies, nations, to protect their networks. And therefore we train, we share best practices. We have this Center of Excellence in Tallinn, Center of Excellence on Cyber Threats, where we help other allies to improve their networks. We have established some guidelines for resilience to protect civilian infrastructure. And we have also actually decided that cyber attacks can trigger Article 5. Because cyber attacks can be as serious, can destroy infrastructure, can cause human suffering as a conventional attack. So we decided back in 2014 that cyber attacks can or may trigger Article 5 if we deem that necessary. Everything we do also to increase the readiness, the preparedness of our forces is also a way to respond to more cyber and hybrid attacks. So we do a lot more, but these are at least the main ways NATO is responding to a security environment where the line between peace and war is more blurred than before. In the old days, it was either peace or war. And actually, nations declared war. They went with the ambassadors and declared war. That's not the case anymore. It's very hard to... the war against Daesh, it's hard to say exactly when it started. It's very hard to say when it ends. And it's actually hard to say where it takes place. it has taken place in Iraq and Syria, but also in many other countries and in cyberspace. So there's a much more blurred line between peace and war than ever before in human history, but we have to be able to respond to also that.
Thank you very much. Now I'm going to pick questions from the audience. Please raise your hands. Please.
Mr. Secretary General, thank you. Lieutenant Colonel Tsai, United States Air Force. What is the future of Turkey in NATO, and what is the impact to NATO?
Turkey is an important ally for the whole alliance for several reasons, not least because of its strategic geographic location. I think we have to understand that the fight against ISIL, Daesh, has been very much dependent on that we could use the infrastructure in Turkey. Turkey is bordering Syria and Iraq. The fact that we were able to close the border has really impacted the flow of foreign fighters into Turkey, into Syria and Iraq. And the use of infrastructure, Incirlik, Konya, other bases for the coalition, for the NATO AWACS planes, for coalition fighters, has been critical for the fight against Daesh. So just the geographic location, if you look at the map, then you see how big Turkey is. And Turkey is really bordering all the turmoil to the south. And I think we all have to understand and recognize the military importance of that territory being available for NATO and for coalition forces to fight Daesh. Turkey is also important because it's bordering Russia in the Black Sea. And then we all know that there are challenges. There has been many terrorist attacks. There has been a very violent, brutal coup attempt in the summer of 2016, July. And of course, Turkey has the right to defend itself. I have stated several times that those responsible for terrorist attacks and those responsible for the failed coup attempt has to be prosecuted according to the rule of law. And that NATO is based on some core values, the rule of law, democracy, and individual liberty. And I expect all allies to respect those values, but at the same time, I very much believe that it is important to understand that Turkey is an ally which has proven extremely important for NATO.
Thank you. Sir.
From the French Center for Doctrine and Teaching of Commands. Thank you. Mr. Secretary General, thank you very much. I had two questions, but actually, thanks to our US colleague, I have only one. So to follow on the first question, I just came back from the position of French defense attaché in the Baltics, and I came back with the conclusion that finally the main problem, or the main issue, I would say, in this region is A2AD, so anti-access area denial. So I would like to know, in your opinion, what the alliance could do more, I would say, than EFP, which is of course part of this of the answer to A2AD. But how the alliance could tackle this main issue in the Baltics. Thank you very much.
So we are taking A2AD capabilities into account when we do our military planning. So it's not a surprise for us that there are access denial capabilities in the Baltic Sea region. So that's part of what we take into account when we do our military planning. We are responding in different ways, partly by increasing our presence in the region. So one of the reasons why we have both increased the NATO presence with the 4 battle groups, combat-ready troops, multinational troops in the 3 Baltic countries and Poland, is to make sure that we have troops there already, and also to help reinforcements if needed. I also welcome that that in addition to the NATO troops, also the Baltic countries and Poland are strengthening their own military capabilities. All the 3 Baltic countries will next year spend 2% of GDP on defense. Poland is already there. Estonia is already there. They will be joined by Lithuania and Latvia next year. So these countries are also investing heavily in their own home defense forces. On top of that, you have the NATO troops, and on top of that, you have also some bilateral US presence with a new brigade and with some additional US forces. So there is a significant NATO and NATO ally presence in the Baltic region, partly as a response to the access denial capabilities of Russia. Then, one of the reasons why I believe it's extremely important that we invest in modern technology, and why we are requiring from our allies not only to increase defense expenditures to 2% of GDP, but also to spend 20% on that on investments in modern technology, is that we know that we need the most advanced technologies, the most advanced weapon systems to be able to penetrate the A2AD capabilities. So that's another part of our response. And the third element of our response is to improve military mobility, because the whole idea is to prevent the conflict. And the way to prevent the conflict is to have credible deterrence. We have credible deterrence now with the increased NATO presence, the US presence, and the home defense forces in these countries. But if we see that the risk for crisis is increasing, then we will deploy more. And therefore we need to be able to deploy to reinforce before the outbreak of any conflict, to deter conflict. And that's the reason why when we now reform and adapt the NATO command structure, and when we work with the European Union, one of the key elements is military mobility, meaning how can we move forces quickly, if needed, to prevent conflict into, for instance, the Baltic region, if that's the area where we need reinforcements.
Thank you. More questions? Yes, please. Oui, oui.
I'm the chairman of Bureau Défense France, and I'm the former director of OCAR. Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for your speech. And I'd like to come back to what you said on the political systems, the number of systems in Europe, which is a source for lack of efficiency and higher costs for defense.
I'm able to hear you, but
yes, but so I repeat. You've mentioned the number of different systems in Europe, which is a source of inefficiency and a source of higher cost in Europe in terms of capacities for defense. And this is coming obviously from the lack of from the low level of cooperation in Europe between European nations for armaments. I mean, the level of cooperation is about 20% of the amount of defense investment, and this percentage is the same, has been the same for more than 30 years. And you've said that we should not duplicate in Europe what is done in NATO. But obviously, I mean, the military planning in NATO has not been able to cope with this problem for the last 60 years. So don't you think that some capacity of military planning, capacity planning in Europe could help to cope with this difficulty? I mean, to help European nations to increase their cooperation for armament, for defense investment?
Yes, I think that perhaps not the military planning process in NATO, but NATO could help to induce or to stimulate nations to go together And actually we do that because we try very much to promote that nations, when they develop, when they invest in new capabilities, that they go together and have what we call a smart defense or framework nation approach. So we have some examples where, for instance, I think it's Denmark and the Netherlands, they are now working together with some other countries to develop a precision-guided munition together. Some other countries are working to develop new drones and so on. And NATO very much encourage allies going together to develop jointly new capabilities, to have not so many different types, but to then also address the fragmentation. And the good thing is that then you can have a bigger number, and by having bigger numbers you can have the economy of scale, you can reduce the cost both in development, in production, but not least in maintenance, and you also increase interoperability. But to be honest, I think that perhaps EU has an even stronger tool, because the EU is now developing the European Defense Fund. We try to urge allies to go together, but we don't have money to stimulate. Money helps, always. So it's a nice NATO smile, it's nice, but it's even better to have some EU money. Meaning that the EU, with the new defense fund, the whole aim, as far as I understand, after many meetings with the EU leaders, is that they will then fund joint capability developments. And that, I think, will really help. And again, as long as this is not, of course, everyone understands that European Defense Fund should go to European entities, but hopefully they can be also open to work together with non-EU allies, not funding them, but joint projects. Then it's something we just should welcome. And hopefully that will be one of the main outcomes of stronger European defense. Let me just tell you a story which I've told many other audiences, because this is about big national sensitivities, because this is about defense industry. It's about jobs and national pride. And in Norway, we don't build cars, we don't build armor, we don't build many kinds of military equipment, except for ships. Norway we regard ourselves as a big shipbuilding nation. And when I was Prime Minister back in 2000, we were going to build 5 new frigates. And we had an open bid, and the problem was that it was a Spanish shipyard, I think it was Navante, that was actually better than any Norwegian shipyard, and cheaper. That was a big problem, but we decided to build the 5 frigates in Spain. It was close to civil war in Norway after that. And I really believe that one of the reasons why I lost the election the year after was because we decided to build the best and the cheapest Norwegian frigates in Spain. I will never do that again. So the thing is that this is extremely sensitive. What we saw afterwards was actually that Norwegian industry had many contracts because they delivered much of the equipment, much of the also the IT and so on to the frigates. So it just underlines that we can go together, we can have jobs for everyone, but the problem is that we have to overcome some of these national sensitivities to address the fragmentation of European defense industry. So I really hope that the European Union will succeed. That will increase the competitiveness of European industry. It will reduce the cost for European defense. We'll get more defense out of the investments, and it will increase interoperability. So this is one of the reasons why I really believe in a strong European defense, because I think that's the best tool to address the fragmentation of European defense industry.
Thank you very much. So we learned that you were on the verge of civil war in Norway. Yeah. According to your standards, we are in civil war already in France every day. So now the next question, please.
Yeah. I may ask you a question now that I'm not in a position as a commander. Before I was supposed to answer. you are a better place than anybody else to assess the will of the U.S. Current administration to keep its commitment in Europe. And you know as well as us that there is a creeping idea in Europe and some European countries that they could reduce their commitment, even their presence. And we are sure that you have very intensive discussions with President Trump on that.
First of all, thank you. I appreciate very much the time we work together, and I think you raise an important question. And I told some parliamentarians, some members of the National Assembly here in France earlier today, that we have to remember that NATO is an alliance of 29 different nations with different elected leaders, with different views on many issues. And it has been like that for decades, meaning that sometimes we disagree on issues. There has been disagreements between NATO allies since the alliance was established, on the Suez crisis in the 50s, on the Vietnam War in the 60s and the 70s, on the Iraq War in 2003, and many other issues. And that's also the case today, because NATO allies, they have different views on climate change, the Paris Accord, on the question of whether Jerusalem is going to be the capital of Israel, or trade issues. The strength of NATO is that despite all these differences, despite that we are different nations with different culture, different political views on many issues, and leaders from the left and the right and the center and many different political angles, we have always been able to agree on the main task of NATO and to unite behind the main task. And that is that we protect each other, that we defend each other, and that we are stronger together than alone, based on the message from the three musketeers, one for all and all for one. That's the founding act of NATO, I thought. And that's also the case today. I'm not denying that there are different views, but I'm saying that when it comes to the core responsibility of NATO, that we defend each other, that we stand together, that we provide credible deterrence and defense, then we are actually stronger than we have been for a long time, because we have strengthened our collective defense. The world has become more dangerous, but NATO has become stronger, so we are responding. And this is not only something I say, but it is actually something that is happening. Canada left Europe after the end of the Cold War with land troops. The US has gradually decreased every year since the end of the Cold War. The last armored brigade, US armored brigade left Europe in 2013. Now they have redeployed a US armored brigade to Europe. The US has 3 brigades, combat-ready brigades in Europe. They are significantly increasing the number of troops, armor, equipment, supply, exercises of US forces in Europe. Canada is back. Canada is leading one of the battle groups in Latvia. And the US is leading another in Poland, and they are deploying out, also in addition to the NATO troops, they are deploying on bilateral agreements US troops. They have 70,000 troops in Europe now. So I say to you that, well, actions speak louder than words. The US is increasing their military presence in Europe. Canada is back. They have tripled the funding for US presence in Europe. So that's part of the NATO adaptation, is actually that the transatlantic bond has been strengthened with more US in Europe, but also with the European allies stepping up, increasing their defense investments and making their forces more ready, and actually also strengthening European defense, which I regard as a contribution to strengthening the European pillar within NATO. So there are many problems and many challenges, but it's not it's not correct to say that the US is leaving Europe. The US is actually coming back to Europe.
Thank you. Please.
You need a microphone. And we have two. One is working and one is not working, so you should pick the one. Yeah.
Thank you. Major Belcourt, French Gendarmerie. Sir, following your last answer and regarding the current geopolitical situation and Russian position, do you think NATO should or could extend to a new member or strengthen its position and internal relationship in order to improve its cohesion and coherence? Thank you.
Just to be certain, you asked about new members. Yeah. NATO's door is open, meaning that in our founding treaty, the Washington Treaty, it's Article 10, it's clearly stated that NATO's can be enlarged with new members if they are European countries and if they adhere to the NATO standards. The best proof of that NATO's door is open is that we actually enlarged this year with Montenegro. NATO went from 28 to 29 allies when Montenegro was also invited in or became a new NATO ally this spring. Then the question is whether we are going to have new members. We have some aspirant countries, Bosnia and Herzegovina, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, Georgia, and also Ukraine has stated that they would like to move towards NATO and EU membership. My message is that whether these countries are going to become members of NATO or not, it's only up to the applicant or aspirant countries to decide and the 29 allies. No other country has the right to interfere or to try to veto that process. And that's not only something I say, but that is a fundamental principle in, for instance, the Helsinki Founding Act, that every nation has the right to choose its own path. We will never accept that big powers can establish a kind of sphere of influence where they decide what the neighbors can do. And again, coming from Norway, a small country, 5 million people, bordering Russia, it's extremely dangerous to accept that big powers have some kind of influence, some say over neighbors. Small countries, big countries, medium-sized countries have all the enshrined right to decide the path they would like to go themselves. If they want to join a military alliance, it's up to them, and of course the members of the alliance to decide. We are helping Bosnia-Herzegovina, Fyrom, Georgia, and Ukraine, and other aspirant countries with reforming, with modernizing, and then at the end of the day it will be the 29 allies that decides, no one else.
Thank you. So a few more questions, please. I can give you the microphone.
Colin Cameron, I'm from the association Europe IHDN. A little aside just before I begin, Secretary General, is you'd mentioned the two referenda in Norway. I think if the European community had kept the term community rather than union, there might have been a different result. And just on the same theme, I was in the Storting a few years ago when you had a vote on whether you could dispose of some Mauser rifles you'd found under a mountain. And the answer was yes, they could be sold to the hunters, but certainly not to the Swedes. This is the theme of union again. Would you care to say something about your relationship with Sweden, with Finland? The attaches from these countries are in the room today. And could you say a little about NATO's further relationships now that the NATO area seems to be a little more pervious than it was previously? Say Australia, Pacific, out of area in a big way. Could you say a few words
So
on that?
partners, you mean?
Thank you.
So it may be a bit naive, but I think you have a valid point that the fact that the EU changed from a community to a union had a negative impact for those who advocated Norway joining the European Union. My grandfather, actually my grandfather, he became 100 years old. He voted in 1994. He remembered the union with Sweden. And I believe that he voted no, because he is by principle against unions. Because for Norwegians, a union, that's to be ruled by Sweden. And we like Swedes, but we don't like to be ruled by them. And since I'm in France, I can also tell my favorite story. Norway is a very strange country because, you know, the main street in Oslo goes from the parliament to the castle. And that's named after French general, also Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte. Yeah. We call him Karl Johan. And the biggest statue in Oslo is the same French general. And we march around that French general every 17th of May. We don't know exactly who he is, but we are in favor of that man. He became a Swedish king, and the first thing he did was to invade Norway. But we named the main street, then the main statue in front of the royal castle, and we celebrate him every year. So we like Swedes and French generals. But then, having said all this, let me just add that I think that Sweden and Finland, and this I would have said regardless of who is in the audience, I think that the Nordic countries is an example how peace can win over war, and how peace is stronger than conflict in the long run. Because you have to remember that in the Nordic area, we fought each other for centuries. From the Viking area until the Napoleonic War. We fought and fought and fought. And Norway was almost always on the losing side, but we were partly on the Swedish side, partly on the Danish side, but we lost all the time. And really, the Nordic country was a kind of mini Middle East. Then after the Napoleonic War, there has been absolutely peace. And you can hardly find any countries in the world which are so peaceful, so friendly, and which likes each other so much as the Nordic countries. So for me, that inspire me when I look at other regions in the world, when they tell me that it's impossible to love our neighbors or to trust our neighbors. It is possible, because when we can trust the Swedes, then there is no limit for what people. Then the reality is that people can trust each other and they can become friendly, regardless of the history. That's the same actually in other parts of Europe, France and Germany, the same story. Then on the question of countries further away, well, we have an excellent partnership with New Zealand and Australia. We have a strong partnership with Japan and South Korea. These are partnerships which are very important. Because they address also some global security challenges, including, for instance, North Korea and the ballistic missile threat and the development of nuclear weapons. I recently visited South Korea and Japan, and we work with them also in addressing, for instance, the threats from North Korea.
Maybe one last question, please. Gentleman behind, and please be short if you can.
Mr. Secretary General, Lieutenant Colonel Mark Cook, the British Liaison Officer here at the École Militaire. Thank you very much for your expose for what you've given us. You've identified two specific areas of threat, one to the east and one from the southern flank. How can NATO balance those two threats when some countries, including my own, view the east as the major threat, other countries, such as our French allies here, view the southern threat from immigration and terrorism coming up from Africa as a major problem?
The short answer is that we don't have the luxury of choosing either to address the threats and the challenges from the south or the challenges stemming from the east. We have to do both at the same time. And in my speech, I briefly touched upon how NATO has been able to adapt, to do both crisis management beyond our borders and at the same time strengthen our collective defense in Europe. And I'm actually quite impressed by NATO and NATO allies because we have conducted a huge and fundamental adaptation of the alliance since 2014 because the world changed. And the reason why NATO is the most successful alliance in history is that we have proven again and again able to change. As I said, for 40 years we did collective defense in Europe. Then after the end of the Cold War, we did crisis management beyond our borders, and we were not very focused on collective defense. After Crimea, Ukraine, Daesh, ISIL, Mosul, Raqqa, then we have proven able to both do collective defense in Europe and address crisis beyond our borders at the same time. So there's just no way we can choose. We have to do both at the same time, and I'm absolutely confident that NATO is able to do that because that's exactly what we have done since 2014.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General. I join my thanks to the thanks of the director, and we're really honored you choose to come here and make your presentation, your speech. Thanks again, and on this optimistic note that we can fight against two enemies simultaneously, I thank you again, and I wish you all the best for you and for the alliance. Thank you very much. Thank you.